So, this just puts things a bit into perspective of anybody you can think of in terms of Greek and Greek history and so forth and so on, that all of those philosophers, mathematicians, and scientists, doctors, that those are the ones who studied in Kemet, and they actually documented it. So when you look at stolen legacy, the Greeks themselves weren't so much interested in stealing because they actually would attribute the source. They say we got this from Kemet, and they would actually talk, bravely and with confidence. I learned it from Kemet, because that's the only way that they could get legitimacy as a real philosopher. How can you say you're a mathematician and you didn't study in the land of black people? How can you say you're a scientist and you didn't study in the land of black people? How can you say you're a doctor and you didn't study in the land? So they're actually bragging about it, right?
Boom, boom, boom. Latitude 0, longitude 0. Speaking from the center of the world, Ghana. This is where we are. This is the center of Pan-Africanism. Moving black people forward, uniting us on the same platform, telling the stories that concerns us. Boom! Zo TV Talking Points. Do not change the dial. Stay tuned.
To refer to the whole continent, then we're saying literally the land of black people, which is the same thing as Kemet. So for me, it's not even so much that we need to use the word Kemet itself. It means that the concept behind it, that means land of black people. But again, that's why all of these white Egyptologists and the ones who are their paid agents are so dead set in making you only say Egypt. But if you ever hear the word Kemet, they'll say, no, it's only the soil. But what about Khnum, who made us out of that soil? They can't answer the question. So let's come back. So the term hoot was the hoot. That's referring to like an enclosure.
How do you spell it?
I'll have to write it in Medunetra. I can show you how it's written. But if you're going to transcribe it, it would be the aspirated H, the letter W, and then the T. Okay. Aspirated H is the one with the dot underneath it, so that's hoot. Okay. So it's referring to the word for enclosure. So hoot, Heru, that would be the enclosure of Heru. Heru is symbolized by a falcon. If I say, hoot kapata, which I was referring to earlier, that's what they refer to as a temple. Now, I've been to, several of these places which would be referred to as hoot in classical Kemet. And something strikes me in that if you look at the history of non-black people, if you look at the Greeks and the Romans, all the way to the Americans, they mark history by wars that they fight. So they say, during the time of World War I, they say during the time of the Korean War, World War II, that's how Vietnam War, that's how they mark history, is through wars. Now, interestingly, in Kemet, the main marker of history is when you have a unification between what's referred to as the spiritual realm and the physical realm. And these are like at the Sed festival, at the Heb festival, at the, you have all these different festivals that are going on. And it's the same as like Akwazide, right? Mm-hmm. So at Akwazide, what goes on? Basically, you'll pour libations, you'll call on all the ancestors, all of the Abosom, what would be Vodunsi, So it's a family reunion. Yeah. It's a union between that which can be seen and that which is not able to be seen. And that's how we mark history. So if you go to temple after temple, it shows that in the regnal year, Renpet set of this ruler, year 9, so forth. So it'll go through the whole thing, and it shows this ruler who is making offerings at one of these festivals or in these major markers. So like wars are documented. Like that's what I'm saying. I have a book where I'm looking at these different wars. We're keeping the non-black people out, but that's not the main way that we're marking history. We're marking history on the basis of every time that basically things are like how they were in the very beginning. Okay. So in the very beginning, there wasn't a split between things that are seen and unseen. Everything is noon, right? What they call the primordial waters. But eventually things start to be differentiated into things that are physical and then things that are quote unquote spiritual and intangible. But what happens at all of these festivals, you can look among the Akan, the Ebre, the Ga, you can go to the Dogon people, you can go to classical Kemet, you can go everywhere on the entire continent and beyond, Haiti, everywhere black people exist, we have these types of things which are not only family reunions, like, even those are important where it's just, my cousin, my uncle, but like the greater family reunion, which is the unity of the spiritual and the physical, coming together. So that's what these quote unquote temples, the Hut, are actually for, is that they have all of these markings, all of these writings about how we're actually keeping time. And in classical Kemet, this is a place that invented the idea of 365 days in a year. This is a place that invented the idea of 24 hours in a day.
It's not Tails. It's not Tails that invented. It's not Tails that invented that.
No.
Yeah, we'll come to that one as well.
So you had what they refer to as decans. You had 360 days in the year, and then you have these 5 what are referred to as epigomenal days, which are dedicated to each individual divinity. So that's where you get the 365 days, and then from there, that's where you started to have the Romans, who you have the Julian calendar, the Gregorian calendar. All of those are coming from the original calendar of classical Kemet, because again, the Kemetu, the black people, are the ones who taught the Greeks. The Greeks taught the Romans. The Romans invaded the Brutish Isles and taught the Brutish how to read and write, because they didn't have these Latin characters. When you learn the alphabet, right? Alphabet is literally saying alpha, beta, which are the first 2 letters of the Greek alphabet. But all right, so where did they get it? Did they get it from the Greeks? No, not directly. Yeah. The Greeks taught the Romans, and the Romans taught the Brutish.
So basically, almost all the Greeks philosophers studied in Kemet.
Almost all. Any of those who have, who you tend to know about, right? Yes. The famous ones, so forth and so on. If you start looking at Plato, Aristotle, Thales, if you start looking at Solon, and I think we mentioned Thales before. So Solon, the lawgiver, and then Thales is said to be like the first quote unquote philosopher. But all of these, all the ones you've heard of for the most part are going to be the ones who studied in Kemet. And actually, if you read the Laws, is that correct? Yeah, the Laws by Plato, he actually talks about going to Kemet and how many drachma it costs for a ferry to go to Kemet. So you can actually find out how much he paid in order to study in Kemet.
So we're fighting this.
Just really quick, let me land on this. So in the Laws by Plato, he mentions where he's asked about Greek education, and he says that when he is asked about Greek education, he's embarrassed, not just for himself, but for the whole of the Hellenic world. And he says that Greek education is education for guzzling swine. He's talking about pigs. Now, and he says that he wishes that the freeborn amongst the Greeks could learn as much of their numbers and letters as the innumerable crowd of children in what he called Aegyptos, which is, Kemet. Now, this tells you a lot, because nowadays we're taught that we need to look up to the Greeks. Yeah. We're supposed to look up to Plato, but Plato himself is ashamed of himself as a Greek person, and he wishes that he could be like the people, the innumerable crowd of Kemet. So that tells you a couple of things. One, innumerable crowd means that everybody can read. That means if you go into the so-called temple, everybody, can come in and they have some understanding and reading of what they're seeing, what happened on this date, so forth and so on.
So at the same time, the temple was like a whole school and university on its own, where knowledge is being shared. So
you have these Peru Ankh. So these are houses of life, and these date all the way, right? Houses of life, and these date all the way back to the first, what's referred to as the first dynasty, where, it was places where people would study and practice medicine. So these are the first, what we could refer to nowadays as universities, places, major places of learning. And that's where 3,000 years after the fact, that's where the Greeks came to study as well. So anything that you know about in terms of the Greeks, knowing about science, knowing about mathematics, knowing about medicine. So the Hippocratic Oath, this is referred to as Hippocrates. Hippocrates actually worshipped Imhotep, right? Imhotep. In the temple, in his temple of Asclepios, that was referring back to Imhotep, who was seen to be as a divinity of medicine, right? So, this just puts things a bit into perspective of anybody you can think of in terms of Greek and Greek history and so forth and so on, that all of those philosophers, mathematicians, and scientists, doctors, that those are the ones who studied in Kemet, and they actually documented it. So when you look at stolen legacy, the Greeks themselves weren't so much interested in stealing, because they actually would attribute the source. They say we got this from Kemet, and they would actually talk, bravely and with confidence. I learned it from Kemet, because that's the only way that they could get legitimacy as a real philosopher. How can you say you're a mathematician and you didn't study in the land of black people? How can you say you're a scientist and you didn't study in the land of black people? How can you say you're a doctor and you didn't study in the land? So they're actually bragging about it, right?
Boom, 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 boom.
It's in modern times, in the 1800s, after the Rosetta Stone was deciphered by Champollion the Younger, that this is where they had cognitive dissonance. And you can read a book called Intellectual Warfare by Nana Jacob Carruthers that goes into it. Up until this time, everyone in the world knows that Kemet is black people. There's no dispute, and people don't even want it. They're not even trying to claim it. If you look at Horem Akhet, what they call the Sphinx, everything, all of the carvings, it shows that it's black people, and it's not even disputed. But once they started to translate it, and then they got an idea of the depth and the breadth of what they were actually reading, that's when they started to say, well, these are just, and Champollion's older brother said, even though they have black skin and woolly hair, they're not black people. They're just dark-skinned white people. So they're trying to claim it, and then they said, oh, no, a great white race came in and built all these pyramids, and then they disappeared. So like they can't even deal with the people who not only called their land the land of black people, who not only called themselves black people, who refer to themselves individually as black people, but on top of that, they did all these things. These are the people who we're enslaving right now. And you actually have this in Count Volney, right? So this is a white guy who's writing, and he's talking about the irony of it all, that these people who we are now enslaving and treating as nothing are the ones who taught us letters and, mathematics and sciences and so forth. So he's writing this, and Champollion's older brother is the one who's responding to Volney, who's like, okay, even though they have black skin and they have woolly hair, that doesn't mean that they're black people. They're just dark-skinned white people. So
yes,
it gives you an idea of the extent that they'll go to.
ZoTV Talking Point. I think I will be coming to another whole section of us talking about black people were able to write. Because as I said, when we were growing up, we were made to believe that we never wrote. And for us to give birth to civilization, to have all these great philosophers from the Greek land to have learned from Kemet, which is the land of black people, I'm so surprised that, there is some sort of empirical evidence to show that our people did, write a lot. Mm-hmm. Anyway, I have one other question to ask you, something that is bothering my mind, and I think that somebody will think maybe I'm crazy to ask that. Is the African map upside down?
Now it's upside down, but it didn't start off that way. Okay. Right? So
I'm not that. Mm-hmm. The reason why I asked that is because then I want to follow it again. Where is the source of the Nile? Mm-hmm. The source of the Nile, I think, is around East Africa, Uganda. Mm-hmm. So, if the source is in East Africa there, then that means the Nile is flowing from like that, going. Mm-hmm. So the Nile is not flowing from Egypt. Mm.
You can't flow uphill.
You can't flow uphill.
Exactly.
That is why.
And then also that's the migration pattern, is that people aren't paddling against the stream.
Thank you.
And trying to go up there. They're coming from these what they refer to as the highlands.
Thank you.
They have White Nile, Blue Nile, Adbara.
So that is why I asked the question if the map.
So let me break it down. So the oldest map of topological interest is known as the Turin Papyrus map, and it was made by Turin Papyrus map, and they call it that because they name it after Turin, Italy, where they stole it and took it to. But it was actually composed by Amen Nacht, which means Amen is victorious. Those who are saying Amen at the end of your prayers, Amen is one of those divinities you were mentioning before, one of the Necheru. So Amen Nacht, son of Ipui, is the one who made it. And what's interesting is that it's a south-up map. Now, why is that interesting? One is because the word for left and east is the same word, Yabit. And then the word for and the word for west and right is the same word, Imintet, right? Now, why is that significant? So if you look at what you're referring to as East Africa, think about Somalia, right? Mm-hmm. It's on your left-hand side because the word for east and left is the same word.
Yeah.
If you think about Senegal, right, anywhere in quote-unquote West Africa, the word for right and west is the same word. Now, why is that? Because if you look at the people who are very heliocentric, to use that term, everything is around Ra, the life giver, the sun that gives life, right? So those who are in the northern hemisphere, which is where classical Kemet was located, for the most part, all the way up until they made their way to the equator, you have this ecliptic, which is the apparent path of the sun. Now, if you look at where the sun rises and you're in the northern hemisphere, you'll look towards the equator and it will appear to be rising on your left-hand side.
Yes.
So the word for the place where the sun rises, east, and the word for left is the same word.
Yeah.
This means when you're going to represent it on a map,
Yeah.
then the place where the sun rises east,
becomes east.
And the left-hand side, I'm going to make my map with the east on the left-hand side.
Yeah.
And then by the same token, again, to see where the sun rises, to see that ecliptic, to see where it now sets, right? That's going to be on your right-hand side. You're looking towards the equator.
Yeah.
If you look away from the equator towards the so-called North Pole, you're not going to see the sun. You can stand there all day and you'll see your shadow, you'll never see the sun. So to actually see the sun, to see where the sun sets now, you have to look towards the right, right? And that's the word imentet. That's now referring to the west. So that's one part. The second part is that you had Resut. This is referring to the south. And now that's Upper Kemet. So that one is entirely based on solar phenomena in terms of when I'm going to make a map. I'm going to make east on the left, and then I'm going to make west on the right. But then also in terms of the conception, and they still do this. I thought it was interesting because they don't really do this in like the United States where I was born and raised. So people say atomic down. It's like, why they call it atomic down? Because the elevation is lower than atomic junction. They have all these things where it's like this one and then this down, this one and then this down. And like, if you're used to it in Ghana, so it doesn't even like register like, oh, well, everyone does that. But like, you're not really dealing with things in terms of, I'm going to call this thing in terms of its relation to another point that's higher up, like that in terms of even the names of everyday phenomena like this. But that's what you had in Kemet. So that is Upper Kemet, because that's where the highlands are, the Ethiopian highlands. You have, again, as mentioned, the White Nile, the Blue Nile, Atbara. You have, the Khartoum, which is where you have the joining together. Then they come all the way down to sea level. That's up. So not only does it make sense from their perspective in terms of east and west, but also why would south not be up when literally it's up higher than, the north? And then you go all the way down to the Mediterranean Sea. And when you think about it, that is at sea level. So that's now what they call the Hut, which is, what's referred to as the delta, right? So now that's all the way down. So it makes sense for their perspective. So if any of your, watchers, viewers are going to look it up, you can look up the Turin Papyrus map yourself.
Yes.
And, I'm not making the map. Like, I can't even see the map without going through, those who've stolen it and taken it to Turin, Italy. So, all of this is referring to about a 15-kilometer stretch of Wadi Hammamat, right? So it's a relatively small map, but the most significant thing about it is not just showing a map to, the mines there, but it's showing that south is at the top. So now it comes down to the question of, well, why do we have maps now where north is at the top? And it comes down to, the Eurasian cartographers who decided, you have the Mercator map, where it looks like this western peninsula of Eurasia that they pretend is a continent is called Europe, right? It's not a continent, but they pretend like it's a continent because really it's just the westernmost peninsula of Eurasia. Yeah, but they make it look bigger than it actually is in relation to other land masses. They also make it look more centralized. So you have others who they really don't, deal so much with the south should be up, but at least they try to correct the land masses in relationship to each other. Because if you look at that map, the Mercator map, which is what most of us grew up with, it looks like, what is this? Greenland is as big as the entire continent. Yeah. It makes it look like all of these, little places. So they'll say, oh, well, they did it because it's easier for navigation and the longitude and latitude. Yeah. But it also comes from their psychology that they want to centralize themselves and say that they're above and so forth and so on. So that's why there are corrective attempts by other map makers to actually make it look like it actually is.
Yeah. What do you think modern Egyptians now in Egypt think about the story of Kemet? That it is black people's story. Do they accept it, or they think it's some bogus story that we've put together?
So the ones who invaded are very much aware of it. And I was actually shocked. The first time I went to Kemet, I was shocked that they hadn't whitewashed all of the walls. But what they do, to make it look like arrows, because you'll go there right now and you'll see that all the depictions look like you. They look like me on the walls. The rulers, you'll look at images of Mentionhotep. I expected to go there and see that they had painted them all white, right? But they show them with my skin tone, with your skin tone, with his skin tone, my daughter's skin tone. They like left, for the most part, them alone, except for the fake bust of Nefertiti, except for, which one is this?
The fake what? Bust.
Bust. Like,
okay, yeah.
So they have that one made out of plaster of Paris. Like in classical times, they would actually make it out of stone. So it's when you go to the Egyptian Museum, I actually have a photo that I took where you can actually see Nefertiti with her nose, with her lips. So it's not made out of plaster of Paris, it's carved in stone. And you as a black person, you can't even set your hand on it because they got it behind glass. But the one that they've put out to the whole world is the one made out of plaster of Paris that was made in the early 1900s, right? So they have a few of these like forgeries, very clear, forgeries that are designed to look like, antiques. They'll like break off the nose and then take, one of the eyes out, and now it looks quote unquote antique. But it's plaster of Paris. What ruler would, have this bust made out of plaster of Paris when you're actually, the real one is made out of stone and she looks just like your mother and my wife. You understand? So that's,
So they haven't whitewashed everything.
Exactly.
Okay.
They've whitewashed some. When you go there, you'll see a lot of the noses are broken off. Like even when you're in the museum, you'll see that a nose is broken off. And in some cases, they'll redo the nose and they'll make it look more beak-like, to make it look like their own vulture beaks or whatever. But, again, you'll go there and you'll see all of these images. And what they'll do is they'll say, oh, it's just symbolic. It means that the people are fertile. And I'm like, yeah, we are fertile. Black people, we are fertile. I have 5 children. So what they try to do is they'll give you a story. And if you're dumb, and if you are illiterate, so me, I read and write in Medu Neter, and that's actually what I teach at the University of Ghana. Once you can read, then you can actually understand what's going on. So they know that they just got there with the spread of Islam. So around the time of the 600 CE is where they, came to spread Islam at the point of the sword. That's where the Arabs came in. And we know this is all, documented. We know actually the date, the years that they came in, because they themselves documented it. But then they'll say, yes, our ancestors. And they'll look. Imagine an Arab, Lebanese guy coming in here and saying, "Yes, you're my ancestor, Zozo." Yeah. Like you're not my son. No. We don't look alike at all. So that's that.
Thank you very much for coming. I think that you should keep watching us, subscribe, like, share our page, and maybe our next trip somewhere next year we'll be planning to go to Egypt with Kambon. We'll let Kambon lead the tour and we go to Egypt.
And if I can mention,
that would be very nice to have a tour from Ghana to Egypt, to go back to our roots, and look at certain things that we talk about, and actually see it with our eyes. Boom, Zo TV.
So I want to invite all of you to the Abibi to Me conference and the Sankofa journey. So even though I've been unofficially banned from modern day Egypt, that you can still come here to this part of the land of black people. And that is through the Sankofa journey. That's SANKOFAJOURNEY.com. And with that, the Abibi to Me conference, the second historic Abibi to Me conference, is part of that. With that, we're honoring my father, Baba Kamal Kambon. And also, we're going to have a documentary called Quiet Warrior. So you can check out Abibi to Me. That's ABIBITUMI.com/Quiet Warrior. You can even see how you can impact that documentary and become a producer for that documentary, as we have a call for producers out right now. Also, the research that I've been sharing, you can go to abibitumi.com/shop. There you can look at my PowerPoints and presentations, and all of that is there. I actually read through the Medu Neter for all of these texts that I'm talking about, and through that you can actually learn how to read and write Medu Neter yourself. So you can check that one out as well. And then also, as I mentioned, I have a Cash App. So anyone who wants to hit me up on Cash App, you can go to Obinfo Obadele. You can put it out to Obinfo Obadele, and that's spelled OBENFO OBADELE. They don't have the O, which I would prefer, but so they have it as O. So again, that's the Cash App $ OBENFO OBADELE. And you can support the groundbreaking work that we're doing here in contemporary Kemet to once again make this a land of black people. And that's really what all of these white people fear, is that once we understand the meaning of Kemet, then we'll say, well, what did we do in classical Kemet and how can we do that right now?
Thank you.
If we understand that we used to build walls, what are the contemporary equivalents of the walls to keep them out? If we understand that in classical Kemet we drove them out, what's our contemporary version of driving them out of the land of black people? Once we understand that, that's where the whole world changes.
Thank you very much.
Zo TV Talking Points. Do not change the dial. Stay tuned.